Today, let's talk a little bit about what was going on in North Africa during World War II. Up to this point, we've talked about Europe, we've talked about Poland, we've talked about France, Battle of Britain. The next place that, once the Battle of Britain dies down and the Germans kind of give up on that, they kind of shift their efforts a little bit and they start to move into Northern Africa. What they're really trying to get to is the oil fields of the Middle East. They really go ahead. There's not a lot of oil in Europe, and so the Germans, in order for their war machine, in order for the Wehrmacht, the German army, to stay mobile, to stay moving, they needed access to oil, and that's what North Africa was all about. The commanders that are relevant here that you need to be aware of, really a few. Erwin Rommel was the commander for the Germans, sometimes referred to as the Desert Fox because of his uncanny ability to kind of get out of trouble and to stay in the fight. For the United States, another famous commander, George Patton. George Patton, again, arguably our best battlefield commander during World War II. He and Rommel actually had a lot in common. Both were pioneers in using tank warfare. Patton actually learned about tank tactics from reading a book written by Erwin Rommel, nicknamed his Old Blood and Guts. Is one of the nicknames that they give him because of his personality a little bit. So you had the Desert Fox versus Old Blood and Guts. And then you had Montgomery, who was the commander for Great Britain. And again, that's actually who Rommel ends up fighting for most of the time. Patton kind of comes in a little more at the tail end of the thing. So what actually happens? The war in North Africa is primarily a tank war. And initially the Germans encounter a fair amount of success. They come down through Italy and come across into northern Africa, and they start moving towards Egypt. And again, the goal being the oil fields of the Middle East. But they end up getting stopped just as much because of Hitler's incompetence as anything else. It seems to be a general theme, as well as British deception. What ends up happening was Adolf Hitler kind of jumps the gun here, and he also opens up a second front against the Soviet Union. He probably should have let that non-aggression pact that he signed with the Soviet Union prior to the invasion of Poland sit for a little bit longer and focused his attention and his supplies on getting to the Middle East, but he doesn't. And so he refuses to send Rommel supplies that he needs. And the supplies that he does send, they end up getting sunk. And the reason why they end up getting sunk is because of a German oversight. It turns out there's this tiny little island, almost smack dab in the middle of the Mediterranean, called Malta. It was controlled by the British. And the Germans thought it would be just fine if they just dropped a few bombs on it and kept on going. So they just bypassed it, and they let the British hang on to it. They reasoned that the naval force that was there was so small it would be insignificant. But the thing about Malta is that it was big enough to actually have an air base. And so from Malta, British airplanes could really command the entire Mediterranean Ocean. Throw on top of that the fact that the Germans or the British had cracked the German code, the German naval code, and the British knew exactly when and where all the different shipments were coming, and they could go ahead and sink the ones that they knew were critical to the campaign of Erwin Rommel. And this really slows the Germans down. And this really enables the U.S. to go ahead and come and reinforce the British. The campaign will actually end up failing May 13th, 1943, and Rommel will have to surrender in Tunisia. It's really the first significant surrender of a German army in World War II. 350,000 Germans are dead or are captured. And it really, after this, the United States and Britain will be able to hop across to Sicily. The Americans in Northern Africa, part of their operation was called Operation Torch. That was the code name for it. Begins November 7th and 8th, 1942. So again, we're talking about a little over a year after the Battle of Britain here. And we land at Casablanca. In fact, if anybody's ever seen the movie Casablanca, it's set along this lines, where it ends with the French and the Americans starting to cooperate and starting to plan for the eventual invasion of Northern Africa. And then from North Africa, Montgomery and Patton will meet up in Tunisia. They'll hop across to Sicily and then eventually to Italy, and they'll start moving up through the Italian peninsula onto the rest of Europe.